All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. I'm getting all my cues on when I'm supposed to come up here, and I've got all this pressure because we got Mitchell building me up, and I know Ellen's been a big cheerleader, and I apologize to any of you who've had to talk to Teresa about me because she is relentless and such an advocate for me, so I'm very grateful for that as well. But it's really awesome to be here, and it's kind of tricky when you come speak someplace new because you're used to Mitchell and his great preaching and these different types of ways that things are done, and then I sort of come in, and how do I establish sort of credibility that you would want to listen to something I had to say? Most of the times when we go to churches, if I'm not speaking, people come up and try to share the gospel with me because they think I might be homeless because of my beard or something like that. So it's all relative, right? Perspective is everything. And I just wanted to share a quick story of perspective. When I was a little kid, I was about 4 or 5, I was playing the game Chutes and Ladders. And so, you spin the wheel and you move forward 3 or 6, and I got that really big slide. And so I spin a 3 and I'm supposed to go down the big slide. And so instead of moving forward 3 spaces, I move backwards 3 spaces. And this was sort of the defining moment in my relationship with my mother, where the forces were going to be at odds, and so she was determined. So she gets out the directions and reads the directions, and it says to move 3 spaces. But it doesn't say to move 3 spaces forward or 3 spaces backwards. And the only reason, not to mention that I won that argument, is to say that sometimes we need to change our perspective. All too often, we sort of read the verses or do the things, and we sort of become part of this thing, this process. And really what we need is just a change in perspective, because if we can all be honest, the state that our country is in right now, the state that our city is in many different ways, with the migrant crisis like Mitchell had mentioned and things, we're in a really tough situation. There's lots of division, there's lots of hate, there's lots of misunderstanding. So I think if it's not so much about changing our minds, but our perspectives, that sometimes things can start there, right? And that was Paul's story, right? He was on the road, and Jesus came and changed his perspective. He still had all that knowledge. He came from this pedigree and this place of privilege. And that's my story to a certain extent. I grew up very privileged, private education, and had all the advantages that led to my success from a worldly standpoint. Was able to earn my PhD and become this well-known and famous in certain circles sort of trainer within health and fitness, but all the while I was just like Paul. I was not killing people literally, but figuratively with my words, and I had all this anger and this arrogance that led to me destroying my family through alcohol and adultery and all these things. And it wasn't until God said, hey, that's enough, and changed my perspective, that my life started to change, and that my words were then meant to give life, not bring death. And although I did get saved about 10 years ago, it was really the first mission trip I went on, so be careful, kids, that my faith really had to overcome my fear. To come into this room and to say you believe a certain thing is easy at a certain level, right? But it's when you have to put your faith into practice, when your faith has to overcome your fear, that all of a sudden becomes so much more challenging. So I chose to take that step that led us on this crazy journey from Stone Oak down to the east side. We sort of had all the privilege still at that point in my life, and it was safe, it was comfortable, and it was convenient. But God had a different plan and a different calling. So my wife Jen, who really should be up here speaking because she has so much more wisdom and is clearly so much better looking than I am. But she will refuse if I were to bring her up here. So you're getting the second best option at this point. But we moved down to the east side. It's just up. I'm a little disoriented to where I'm at in the building, but just up the road, but kind of between here and the AT&T Center. And so often you hear all the stories of the violence, and you can drive by and see all the clear effects of poverty. But that's really not the reality. There's different stories going on there, right? And it really is about this idea of stories to me. Jesus was a storyteller. I've tried to become this storyteller. And I could talk about programs and statistics from SA Heals, but really what I do like to share is about the people and the stories, because we can have programs and statistics and be based on performance all we want, but if we really can't integrate our lives and have stories of impact that God is doing, that Jesus is doing, then what good are we doing? And so my hope today is just to be able to share some stories that will hopefully change your perspective on how to sort of love where you live. Because knowing about me is not going to change that. But hopefully, if just in small ways we can learn to know about Jesus a little bit differently, it will change all of us collectively, right? So, where we live in this city, this idea of loving where we live really centers around getting to know people's stories, getting to know who people are, to be known. You see that first with Jesus, with the woman at the well. He was sitting, got to know her, and then when she went away, come meet this guy that knew everything about me, that there was this profoundness in being known. And also when Jesus would say, when we come and we present our works, he's like, I never knew you. This is the words of Jesus, that he never knew us. And so there's this thing to be known that is sacred, that we have to really sort of take a step back and think about and look at. Do we know one another? We sit in this room together, right? We come to church based on similar beliefs and thoughts, and some of us do have those relationships, but to be truly and deeply known, that's a scary, vulnerable place to be. And I think, though, that's how we learn to love our city. That's how we learn to love where we live. And we all have a place that we live. Yes, amen? Like God has placed us in these homes and in these communities and on these streets. And so how do we love those places well as the city that we call home in San Antonio? And I want to just talk about, like, how do we love where we live, but I first want to talk about how do we love our neighborhoods well? How do we love our communities? How do we love our streets well? And so I'm going to do that through storytelling and hopefully pointing to Jesus as best as I can. And so I also like to have illustrations or pictures. So if you could put the first picture up for me. I'm going to tell the story of Lamont and Kirsten. And so Kirsten is on the left on the bigger bike. He is one that we are sort of, God has given us to go after. Like, we're going after him. But Lamont is the one on the right. Stinking cute. And he's the one that God actually gave us. We've been able to adopt him and love him, and he has changed a lot in our lives. But also the story is not just of Lamont, it's of his mom, Sarah. Sarah is someone we met in the neighborhood. If you were to have met her, she would have said her name was Star. So a lot of our friends in the neighborhood, they have street names, as they would sort of call them. And so we met Sarah. She was walking on the streets, and when you're in our neighborhood, in many ways, if you're walking on the streets, you're actually working the streets, if that makes sense. There's a lot of, at times, drugs, and there's some prostitution, and there's a lot of things that do go on. Now, that's not the story for everyone. That was just the story for Sarah at the time, and really Jen in particular really just sort of went after her and started to love her. She was pregnant with Lamont at the time, and we just wanted to love her and try to get that baby to the hospital as healthy as possible. We had no plans to adopt Lamont. It wasn't this big grand scheme that we sort of had, but we just sort of invited her into our lives. We invited her into our homes, and we just tried to love her well. We didn't look at her like a prostitute. We didn't treat her like a problem. We loved her like a person. And we did that to the best way that we could, the best way that we knew how. We loved her and treated her like a person. And here's the thing, she loved Lamont so much that she let us love him too. And that was a real gift and a real sacrifice that she made. And to look at Sarah, and you could sort of judge her on a certain level, right? She's struggling, making some really potentially bad choices. But if you start to learn about her, that when she was little, she had to sleep on the floor because there was drive-by shootings at her house, that when she was 12, she was raped, not only raped, but raped at the school that she was going to, that when she was 19, she was kidnapped and taken across the border and abused. And so you start to understand her story. You start to understand the why behind the what. It starts to change your perspective on the choices that she was choosing to make. And so we just sort of set out to love, so that there was no longer an us and them, but only a we. Right? That there's no longer this separation, that there's no longer this divide, regardless of what she thinks or we think or she does or we do, that we are called to love. We are called to love one another. And in particular, one of Jesus' final prayers was that they would all be one. In John 17, that we would all be one. that we would love one another so well that we would all be one. That doesn't mean we're all going to think the same. That doesn't mean we're all going to look the same and do the same, right? There's still some realities that we're all made to think individually and made unique and created in this way, but to love one another and to be one, to have unity, not uniformity, is one of Jesus' final prayers. And so I think we have to really look at that. How do we love well? How do we learn someone's story? How do we get to know them? Now, it might seem simple, especially for our kids. I'm not even going to give you the answer, but I bet the kids can get this one, right? If someone's trying to tell you a story, what do? Listen. Right? All the parents in here want their kids to listen. Amen. It's like they would just listen, But although it seems so difficult at times, the reality is so simple that to get to know someone's story, to get to know them, is to listen. Is to listen to them. Even Jesus said, "He who has ears, let them hear." There's also that verse that he says, "He who has a mouth, let them talk." Actually, that's not a verse. That's not in there. It's actually the opposite of that. Okay? It's actually that you would be quick to listen and slow to speak, to seek first to understand and then to be understood, to listen to people, not to talk at them. Right? And people are dying to be heard. Dying. Look at social media. Look at people are screaming, but nobody's listening. And just the simple act to listen to someone is to allow them to have value, that they would matter, that they mean something, that you would just take moments to hear them. Right? Not in this sort of superficial relational transaction where we're in passing and we exchange pleasantries, or now as we text and just sort of abbreviate everything, and we're losing the art of being able to listen and to be in relationship with someone. And I think it's so sacred, right? Jesus would listen. He would sit at dinner tables. He would talk like he was just there to let them, that he could be present with them and get to know them. Because here's the thing, and here's the sacred thing about it, and the privilege is that once you know someone's story, you can write yourself into their story at that point. You can allow yourself to be written into that story. And here's why that's important, because that's what Jesus did. Jesus wrote himself into our story. It says the Word became flesh and moved into the neighborhood. That each of us in here, maybe some of us not quite yet, but have the story of when Jesus wrote himself into your lives. And that's when your life sort of changes forever, when he writes himself into that thing, that masterpiece that he's writing, that poem that he's creating, that love story that's been written before time, before you. That when we go in and we look to know someone and love someone, it starts with listening to someone, to learn about them, right? With first the opportunity to be present. Like if I'm with Jen and I'm on my phone, I'm not present with her and she doesn't feel like I'm valuing her. That if I can eliminate distractions and turn off devices and do all that and just to be present, right? It's hard for people. Almost impossible. It's hard to even stay present. I've been going maybe 13 minutes. Most of you are like, oh, Mitchell gave me the clock. I'm trying to keep on time, but to be present is a lost art. To be patient with people, to give that process time to be patient as we get to know and build trust and learn about one another, and then just to be persistent. Just to be persistent and consistent because no one else is. So a lot of times you get pushed away if you're scared about being vulnerable. You sort of, I'm not going to let them in. But if you continue to be present and patient and persistent, you can learn someone's story. And then once you've been able to listen and learn, not talk and teach, then and only then can you respond to the person and their story with love and healing. Let me give you this example. Jesus said, healthy people don't need a doctor, sick people do. Right? And so a lot of us in this room might be wealthy, but I would venture to say that most of us people in the room at a certain level are not exactly healthy, right? We sort of cover up those demons and those things that we don't want people to know about. But even if you are healthy, some of us are not. When you're not healthy, most of us would go to a doctor, correct? And so when you go to a doctor, what do? They listen to your heart. They listen to your lungs. They learn about your symptoms and your history, right? Because as they listen to you and as they learn about you, then they know how to then respond. They know how to help treat you so that you can heal and get better. The great physician of Jesus would do the same. Amen. That he's there to listen and to love so that we can be healed. So here's the question I have for some of us. In your neighborhoods, in your lives, who's sick? I mean, I know there's physical sicknesses that a lot of us struggle with and go through and know that people are battling, but I'm talking about sick, depressed, right? Angry, hurting, sick. That the type of healing that only Jesus can offer. I think we have to ask those questions and be able to respond, especially in this room. How many of us are hurting, are depressed, have anxiety, but are so afraid to show it for fear of maybe being judged or, because if you believe in Jesus, you wouldn't struggle with those things. Like if your faith was stronger or better, you wouldn't have to deal with those things. The church really needs to be a place to heal. It needs to be this hospital that people feel welcome to come in, that we need to be able to just pause for a second to listen and to learn so that we can love people better, so that we can love our neighbors better. So before you think of the thing that you can do to reach out to them, to maybe host a barbecue, or all those are good things. I'm not saying anything's bad as far as an act of service. But to truly serve is potentially the first step is just to go start to listen and learn about people in your neighborhood, your next door neighbor, their stories. So then you know how to show them love. Then you know how to write yourself into their story, just like Jesus wrote himself into yours. And then when we transition and we continue to talk about loving where we live, we start to talk about the city of San Antonio, right? The new motto, we just talked about the mayor getting elected. It's a little crazy. Everyone has a political opinion. I'm sure only 16 people voted. It still baffles me a little bit. But the story of our city, we're the city on the rise, right? That's the new motto for San Antonio. We're the city on the rise. And San Antonio has this history, this story. There's the Alamo, right? And the story behind the Alamo, I'm not from here. I know the Alamo. So kids, I'm sure you're in Texas history right now. So we're going to ask some Alamo questions. No, I won't do that to you. I would fail. I would have to cheat off of you, and then I would have to ask for forgiveness and things like that. But so within this, there is some good things going on in our city, right? And I think it's always good at times to see the positive and to see the growth. But while certain people are rising, other people are starting to fall deeper, right? So the city is not on the rise completely. But people in certain businesses and certain areas are on the rise while others are sinking deeper and deeper into poverty. One of the unfortunate stats of our city is that we're the most socioeconomically segregated city in the United States over the last 3 years. And so that would mean the median income of Stone Oak, 78258, down to 202 and 207, just to the near east and near west of us. There's the biggest gap, the biggest disparity in median incomes materially from that standpoint. And so when we have that kind of segregation, not only are we segregated by class, the rich and the poor, we also end up having segregation by race. We unfortunately, institutionally, then also have segregation in our schools and sadly our churches. That our churches become extremely segregated by this as well. And so we look at the story that Jesus told of the rich man and Lazarus. Some of us are not needing to step over the poor man because we've removed ourselves from having to. We don't have to deal with the problem because the problem is not present in our lives. Now, where First Pres is located, you have a really amazing opportunity as a church to minister to those people that are right outside the door. And so that's a blessing. It's just what you choose to do with that. But as we return home, right, where God then scatters us, as we gather, we come together to become equipped and then sent out, right? We get sent out, we get scattered, just like he did at Pentecost. He gathered the people and then sent them out, then scattered them. We all can't just focus on these little pockets where we gather. We must learn to scatter. And that's how we can then start to address the problems in all the communities, in all the neighborhoods, and all the street corners of our city. Right? Because what we need to look at is people don't create these problems that we see on the east side. Segregation that then leads to poverty does that, right? Because it wasn't just a bunch of people that make bad decisions, says, hey, let's live on the east side. right? Like all the bad decisions, like, oh yeah, that's my group right there. I'm going to go hang out with them because that's where people make bad decisions. And there's a whole history of how our city got set up, east and west, and how the Hispanic community settled on the west side and the black community settled on the east side that I'm not going to get into today. My only point is that segregation does lead to poverty and problems for people. And that's why as a church, we have to fight for poverty. Not just material rich and poor, but for poverty, lack of opportunity and resources and things like that. Because when Jesus in Luke 4 said he came to proclaim the good news to the poor, but also to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and to set the oppressed free. That there's this thing with this segregation where he wants opportunity and unity within all of his people. And so as certain groups are being oppressed or held captive, he wants to address those things. And so within our city, we don't just need to write ourselves into this story, right? In our neighborhoods, let's write ourselves into people's lives, into people's stories. But in our city, we need to rewrite this story. The story that's been written for our city, for our churches, we need to rewrite this, right? And so how do we do that? It comes with awareness first, because the church a lot of times with well intentions loves to rush off and fix things, right? I do that with my wife all the time. I rush off to fix her problems. But what does she really want? She wants me to know her and learn about her and listen to her. And so I'm not claiming that we don't need to take action, but I do think we need to not only listen and learn, but try to relook at things, right? Because when you go into the doctor, he asks you to open your mouth and say, ah. When a bone is broken, you go get an x-ray so he can take a closer look. And so we have to a little bit slow down and look at things differently, right? Because Jesus said, he who has eyes, let him see. Right? Because we see what we already believe. And that was the problem with the Pharisees, right? They already had this idea of who the Messiah was, and so even though he was standing right in front of them, they couldn't recognize it because they already were seeing what they believed in their minds. So it influenced and biased and made it so they were seeing things differently than Jesus wanted to have them see. And so our spiritual arrogance many times leads to our spiritual blindness. That we think that we know, and so then we don't see what we need to see. And so then we don't actually get to believe what we're actually looking at. And then once we look, listen, and learn, then we can take action. And so if we look up at the screen and we see the story of Kirsten, just like Lamont had a mom, a birth mom, but unfortunately, she will always be written into Kirsten's story because she died when he was 1. And now he's taken care of by his grandmother, Miss Connie. And to share a quick story, there was an old woman who lived in a shoe. She had so many children, she didn't know what to do. And that was Miss Connie's life. She has kids coming out her ears, and Kirsten is 1. And so she's doing the best she can to raise him, and we're going after him. But the system is not set up for Kirsten, unfortunately, to succeed. We can go back to the first picture still as far as that goes, because the school system and the disparity that Kirsten would have been experiencing, there's lack of resources. But Kirsten is in 5th grade and has already dropped out of school. And so then that predisposes him 3 to 6 times more likely to enter into the jails. He has obviously a lack of opportunities then to find a job. Kirsten ultimately is struggling with some mental health issues that the hospitals and insurance and things, it's so challenging within mental health, and so that system is not getting him the resources he ultimately needs. And with gentrification that's going on, it's pushing and concentrating a lot of crime into the area that he lives. So those are some of the only options that he sees and knows. So the cycle is then doomed to repeat itself unless we break this cycle, right? And some of the stuff some people might disagree with, and I understand that, but I do want to say this has nothing to do with politics. This is only about people in poverty. And so you can show the next picture real quickly. This is a shooting that happened about 2 weeks ago, right across the street from my house. There was 3 teenagers that were shot, 2 were killed, and you can just see the pictures of the 2 little boys looking at that. And that's the story that they're learning. That's the story that's being told, and that's the story that's being taught in these communities. That is the reality for them. This is the story that's being lived and learned on the east side. And so often the response to that is you just sort of have to pull yourself up by your bootstraps, right? You just have to make good choices. But here's what I'm going to say. That's rooted so much in religion and pride that if you've done that in your strength, you're a little bit not acknowledging that it was God who gave you that strength. That if your good choices and the wisdom and the things that you've done, that if you think that that's just because you were wise and a good steward, you're dismissing that God gave you that wisdom and that faith to do those things. And so in that, Romans 5:8, if you hear nothing else, hear this. God demonstrated his own love for us in this, that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. That while we were still sinners, he died for us. That while we were still in the cycle of sin, no ability to pull ourselves up by our bootstraps, no ability to change anything, he came down, wrote himself into the story, rewrote our story, and broke the cycle of sin for each and every one of us in this room. And so how could we then stand off and judge someone's decisions? That's not the Jesus that we know. That's not the Jesus that we follow. So at a certain level, we must start to look at the Jesus that said mercy triumphs over judgment, and also the Jesus of justice. Because in Micah 6:8, he says to act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly. That as Christians, that is the posture that we take on. That we would act justly for those that are oppressed, that we would love to grant mercy, that would triumph over judgment, and that there would just be a humility that we are saved by grace. That by grace and mercy alone, that we are not just completely destitute and bankrupt. That because he loved us so much, he wrote himself into that story and rewrote it for each and every one of us. I'm going to give you one more story just real quick because we can't just talk about it, we have to be about it. So on the screen, you'll see a picture of Ben. Some of you might know Ben. He's actually works for Pay It Forward. It's a ministry partner of First Presbyterian Church. He's been here. Some of you, I think, has his story gone on SA Stories? So you're going to get to listen to his story. I actually met Ben through Lamont's mom, Sarah, on the street. He, of anyone, has pulled himself up by his bootstraps. Again, by the grace of God. So it's only through God's grace that that's happened, but he would be that story, right? But here's the story that Ben still lives out. He's my neighbor, my friend. He pulls into the driveway in our house, and the cop immediately pulls in behind him and shines the light on his car because he didn't put on his blinker. Anybody pulling on their blinker, pulling into their driveway? I ran 2 red lights driving over here. I wasn't even paying attention this morning. And so he pulls in. They shine a light. I guess that's a law. I'm not sure. Either way, pretty minimal, right? Especially for a good guy like Ben. He's wearing this actually exact same outfit. And so the cop gets out of the car, goes up to Ben, puts a gun to his forehead. Something's got to change. Something's got to change. It doesn't have to be this way. Right? We have to make a change because even if you're doing everything right, we're still dealing with some brokenness, right? We're still dealing with some brokenness in our city, in our communities, in our families. We've got to start to change things. We have to start to be the change that we want to see. So what is our response to these realities? Right? And here's what I'm going to say. You cannot blame the world for being the world. That's what they're designed to do. But you can blame the church for not being the church. And that is what we are not doing. We are not living out our design. In the 1900s, there was what was called the Great Reversal. Many of you like the book When Helping Hurts. It was cited in there. The church basically had a paradigm change in their theology where they had been the major force behind taking care of the poor and the orphan and all these things for 1900 years because the church was designed to do that, to address poverty, to be present, to be the light. Something shifted and the church retreated into the 4 walls. And so all of these social systems that so many of us don't like were merely the world's response, merely the government's response to having to fix the problem that the church created when it withdrew from loving the least of these, from loving the neighbors. And so now I do feel a shift. I do feel a shift in the spirit where the church is starting to see that they need to re-engage these problems. But how we re-engage them and when we re-engage them after we've looked and listened and learned, we have to sort of sort through that through the discernment of the Holy Spirit, right? But it is time for us to respond and start to rewrite these stories in our communities and in our city and ultimately in our country, right? And I'm going to finish with this. You can't hear or see these stories by sitting in these seats, right? I got saved in a church. I used to sit on the right side. Everyone, I'm sure, has their seats in these rooms. I get it. It's comfortable, and we kind of just settle in, right? But you're not going to see anything there as he wants to give you eyes to see. You're not going to hear anything there as he wants to give you ears to hear. It's only going to be accomplished by living and loving people in your streets. And so the last thing I would point to Jesus would be that he said, just as the Father sent me, now I send you. Thank you. Let me close this in prayer real quick. Dear Lord, I thank you so much for the opportunity, Lord, just to try to honor you with your word, to point to Jesus and the stories that he told, but ultimately the response that he was seeking as he wants to rewrite stories, that he wants to change the story that's been written, that the cycle of sin would be broken for our communities, for our cities, Lord, and so that you would just give us these eyes to hear or to see and these ears to hear, Lord, and that we would, just like at Pentecost, receive your Spirit to be sent out, that we would, just as you sent your Son Jesus, that we would then be sent to go and do the same, to love the least of these, to help break the cycle. Lord, we love you so much, Lord. I thank you for this opportunity, Lord, and just that all glory would be yours. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.